Vivian used to be the kind of woman everyone turned to when they needed a friendly ear or a little guidance. She had those warm, caring eyes and a graceful way of speaking that made you feel everything was gonna be alright. Her life wasn't just good, it felt picture perfect. She had a husband who adored her and a son who made her days brighter just by walking into the room. Friends and neighbors would often stop by, saying how lucky she was. And honestly, Vivian believed it too. From the outside, she was the personification of calm elegance, always wearing a gentle smile and offering words that could soothe any worry. But sometimes, you know how life can be, there are small signs that trouble's brewing before the real storm hits. She'd feel a strange ache now and then, a slight tug of fear in her heart as if she knew her blissful world might crack any minute. She tried to shake it off by doing her usual routines, cooking her family's favorite meals, working in the garden, or watching her son chase the family dog around the yard. Those little moments should have stamped out any lingering anxiety, but somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered warnings she couldn't quite understand. She'd sometimes wake up in the middle of the night with sweaty palms, her heart pounding for no apparent reason. A sense of dread hovered just out of sight, unexplainable but persistent. Despite all that, Vivian carried on. She remained gentle and graceful, greeting each day with hope. Her family noticed she was a bit off, but they shrugged it away, figuring it was just a passing phase. None of them expected their tight-knit life to be ripped to shreds so suddenly and without mercy. It was a Tuesday, which seemed like the most ordinary day on the calendar. Vivian had dropped her son off at school and headed to her usual errands, a quick grocery run, a brief checkup at the doctor since she was pregnant and liked to keep on top of everything, and then maybe grabbing coffee with her husband if he could sneak out of work. She felt a little more at ease that morning, hopeful even, like maybe that weird sense of doom was finally gone. The sky was clear, the sun was warm, and the day had that sweet promise of normalcy. She was smiling to herself when it happened, an accident so sudden it was like time itself broke apart. One moment, she was checking her rearview mirror, humming along to a song playing on the radio, and the next, there was screeching metal, flying debris, and a jarring crunch that drowned out all other sounds. Her world went black for a moment, maybe longer, and she woke up to chaos. People were shouting, sirens were wailing, and she couldn't feel much of anything except a numb, suffocating terror. When she tried to move, she realized she was trapped in the twisted remains of her car, and panic seized her chest. In the aftermath, everything felt wrong and horrifyingly out of place. She learned her husband's car had been involved too, though the details were fuzzy in her shocked mind. She only knew the paramedics looked grim and no one would meet her eyes. Later, she found out her husband didn't make it. Her son was unaccounted for, lost in the chaos. And as if that wasn't cruel enough, she lost the unborn child growing inside her too. The final blow fell that day and it ripped her life to shreds. In the days after the accident, Vivian felt like she was viewing her reflection through a broken mirror. She stayed in a hospital room for a while, bruised up and sore, her head swirling with painkillers and heartbreak. Nurses tried to be gentle, but she saw pity written all over their faces. She'd look at her reflection, tangled hair, hollow cheeks, eyes filled with an unbearable sadness, and barely recognize the woman staring back. Her mind was stuck on flashbacks, moments so clear they felt more real than the present. She remembered her son's laughter from the previous week when she gave him a big homemade cookie, the light in her husband's eyes when he felt the baby kick for the first time, or the gentle pressure of his hand on her belly. Those memories were like beautiful shards slicing through her every time she replayed them. They were precious but also incredibly painful reminders of what she'd lost. During the quiet hours, Vivian would clutch at the sheets, wishing she could force herself to wake up from this nightmare. She prayed that any second now, her husband would walk in with flowers and her son would jump onto the bed, giggling. But reality was a harsh, cold place and none of that was gonna happen. She was left alone, faced with the haunting knowledge that she had lost not just one precious life, but three. All the warmth she once felt was replaced by a hollow ache that pulsated constantly. Those cracks in the mirror, the ones that seemed so insignificant before, were now deep fissures in her soul. Everything she thought she knew about her life was fractured. She felt broken in a way that sleep or medicine couldn't fix. And deep down, a silent panic was rising because she couldn't imagine how she'd go on. After she was discharged from the hospital, Vivian went home to a quiet house that felt more like a mausoleum than a place of solace. The rooms echoed with absence. She'd walk past the living room and expect to see her husband reading or her son sprawled on the floor with his toys. But every room felt haunted, filled with ghosts of the life she'd lost. She'd sit on the couch, silent tears rolling down her face, wondering if she'd done something to deserve this tragedy. Her nights were the worst. Sleep refused to come, leaving her wandering the halls in a daze. She'd sometimes catch herself standing in her son's bedroom, gently touching his blanket, breathing in what faint scent remained of him, and letting sobs rack her body. There wasn't any manual for this level of grief. Friends tried to call, but she rarely picked up. Even when she answered, she couldn't form words. It felt like her throat was tangled with sorrow. Whenever someone asked, "How are you holding up?" she'd choke on tears and end the conversation. A slow, smothering guilt took hold of her. She replayed the accident in her head, searching for something she might have done differently, one choice that could have saved them all. She wondered if her heartbreak was punishment for some unknown sin. Some days, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling for hours, disconnected from reality. The pain was an anchor, pulling her deeper into a darkness she couldn't escape. She could almost feel a piece of her soul tearing away each time she remembered her son's smile or her husband's voice. Every hopeful thought or comforting memory just twisted the knife a bit more. She was drowning in an abyss of grief, too scared and too broken to believe there was a way out. It didn't take long for whispers to start swirling among the neighbors and acquaintances. People can be kind, but they can also be cruel without realizing it. At first, folks felt sorry for her. They brought casseroles, sent cards, and tried to give her a comforting shoulder. But when Vivian barely responded, when she stopped showing up to community events or church gatherings, the tide started turning. Some said she was wallowing too much, others claimed she was losing her mind. She heard them sometimes when she went out to check the mail or ventured to the grocery store, which became a rarer event as weeks passed. "She's not right in the head," they'd whisper to each other, with pitying or sometimes judgmental gazes. "They say she wanders around at night calling out for her dead family." No one seemed to realize how close to the truth they were. Vivian, in her solitary nights, did walk aimlessly through the house, calling out for her husband and her son, half hoping that if she just tried hard enough, they'd answer. She started questioning her own sanity. She'd wake up drenched in sweat, convinced she heard her son's laughter in the hallway, only to stumble into the darkness and find nothing. It was an unbearable existence, made worse by the feeling that the whole town thought she'd gone off the deep end. Some friends tried to be supportive, but their words felt hollow and their eyes were full of unease. She couldn't blame them. Grief can do strange things to a person. Vivian, who once held herself with such composure, was now jumpy, tearful, and often mumbling under her breath. She felt like her world had spiraled into chaos, and the outside voices calling her unstable only made her wonder if she was slipping away for real. The day Vivian lost the house was the day she realized rock bottom has no mercy. Bills had been piling up and she was in no state to hold a job. She tried to manage the legal and financial details, but her mind just wasn't there. Slowly, her late mortgage payments turned into foreclosure. The bank took over and she was left with nowhere to go. With no relatives close by or willing to help, some had their own families and burdens, others just distanced themselves. She ended up on the streets. It was a cold, cruel world she'd never imagined she'd face. One day, she was a beloved wife and mother in a cozy home. The next, she was huddled on a bench, gripping a thin blanket and trying not to let the bitter wind break her completely. She clung to photos and small trinkets she'd managed to salvage, her son's old toy car, a dried corsage from her wedding, and a couple of pictures of all of them smiling in happier times. People who passed her on the sidewalk either stared or looked away, uncomfortable and awkward. She was just another homeless person in a sea of countless others. Occasionally, someone would drop a coin or two into her lap, but they rarely made eye contact. In those moments, Vivian felt invisible, like she was barely human in their eyes. It was painfully ironic, given how once upon a time she was the neighbor bringing folks homemade pies and offering to watch their kids. Despite the misery of living on the street, part of her was too numb to fully grasp it all. She was stuck replaying her family's laughter in her head, fighting the urge to scream in the middle of the night. If her life was a jigsaw puzzle, all the pieces were strewn across the ground, waiting for someone to notice and help put them back together. In the chaos of losing her home, her husband, and even her unborn child, there was still one burning question that wouldn't leave Vivian alone. What happened to her son? The initial reports from the accident were a mess. They said his father died on impact, but they never found the boy. There were rumors he might have been thrown from the vehicle or maybe rescued by a passerby. Some even speculated he'd wandered off in a daze. Nobody had any real answers and no official statements cleared up the mystery. This uncertainty latched onto Vivian's heart, refusing to let go. She cycled through endless possibilities in her mind. Maybe her son was alive somewhere, lost or injured, but breathing. Could he have been taken to a hospital she didn't know about? Or maybe a good Samaritan picked him up and she'd find him if she just kept searching. The hope that he might still be out there was like a tiny flicker of light in her pitch-black darkness. She asked around, approached cops for answers, and begged social workers to help. Each time, though, she faced the same sympathetic shake of the head. No one had any updates, and her pleas mostly fell on deaf ears. After all, she was just a grief-stricken mother, one among many tragedies the city saw every day. No one had the resources or the urgency to keep digging into an old accident file. Living on the streets only made it harder to search for him, but still, she tried. She'd walk through different neighborhoods, eyes scanning faces in a crowd, heart pounding every time she spotted a boy around her son's age. At night, as she found a spot to sleep, that haunting question echoed in her mind. Where was he, and how could she keep going without knowing? Vivian started revisiting places that once held her happiest memories, hoping to feel closer to her lost boy and maybe catch a glimpse of him. She returned to the ice cream parlor where they used to share banana splits. Her son always got sprinkles, no matter what flavor. But now the place felt eerie. The bright lights and cheerful families only reminded her she didn't belong there anymore. She'd lurk in the corner, scanning every small face that came through the door. Then she ventured to the park where her son used to play. She sat on a bench, recalling how he'd zip down the slide with a giggle that never failed to warm her heart. She remembered the day he got stuck at the top, scared to slide down, and how she climbed up to sit with him until he felt safe again. Those memories were like tiny daggers of both joy and sorrow. She'd watch the other moms pushing strollers, laughing and looking so full of life, and she'd feel a bitter mixture of longing and jealousy. She wished so badly to be one of them again, carefree and confident that the world was a good place. Each location tore her apart and pieced her back together at the same time, fueling her determination to find answers. Even the gritty city bus stops felt haunted because she remembered how her son used to press his face against the glass, making funny faces at passers-by. Now, all that was left was emptiness and her lonely reflection staring back. Through it all, she clutched to the possibility that someone, somewhere, had seen him. That hope kept her going. She lived day to day, scraping by on spare change, each new sunrise bringing another desperate search for the echoes of the past. Life on the streets is a tough teacher, but it also offers strange moments of grace. One day, while rummaging through a charity soup line for a meal, Vivian struck up a conversation with an older woman named Dottie. Dottie had wild gray hair and kind, sharp eyes that noticed everything. She wasn't exactly well off herself, but she seemed to know all the ins and outs of surviving out here. People said she'd been on the streets for years and knew almost every hidden resource in town. While Vivian huddled over her styrofoam cup of hot soup, Dottie casually mentioned an upcoming event, a big deal affair for the homeless community. There was some wealthy philanthropist, a billionaire, who hosted an annual gala or dinner or something like that, inviting folks who were down on their luck to a fancy venue. It's all hush-hush though, Dottie said, leaning in with a hint of excitement in her voice. But I heard they give out clothes, a nice meal, and sometimes even a chance to talk to important people. If you can get in, you might find a lifeline. Vivian's ears perked up. She wasn't sure how a fancy event would help her, but the thought of encountering influential individuals sent a jolt of hope through her. Maybe someone there could help find her son, or at least get the police to look into his disappearance again. It sounded like a long shot, but at this point, a long shot was better than nothing. In that small exchange, Vivian felt a stirring she hadn't felt in a while. It was like a tiny flame reigniting after months of cold darkness. She grasped onto that spark, thinking maybe, just maybe, the universe was throwing her a lifeline after all. After hearing about this mysterious event, Vivian started keeping her ears open whenever she found herself amid groups of people, whether it was fellow homeless folks in alleyways or hurrying strangers in business suits. She realized the rumors about this billionaire's so-called charity gala were buzzing like crazy. Some said it was just a publicity stunt, a way for a rich person to look good in front of cameras. Others claimed it was more of an undercover outreach, no cameras allowed, just genuine help for those who needed it. Nobody seemed to know for certain. One afternoon, Vivian positioned herself at a crowded intersection downtown, eavesdropping on snippets of conversation as people hustled by. She caught bits like, he's paying for their medical treatments, or they set up job opportunities, and sometimes it's a chance for them to speak their truth. She wasn't sure what was real or just gossip, but the possibility that powerful people would be there made her heart pound. She also heard that invitations were scarce, maybe even non-existent, as it was rumored anyone homeless could simply show up at a secret location. Others said you needed a special ticket or a reference from a shelter. The conflicting information both excited and frustrated her. Still, she refused to let it go. With a new sense of urgency, she started asking around for details, forging connections with people who might have attended in previous years. The more she dug, the stronger her conviction grew that this event could be her one shot at finding real help. Her next steps were uncertain, but Vivian was determined to be there somehow. If there was even a tiny chance that this billionaire or his influential crowd could help locate her missing son, she had to take it. It was the first time in ages she felt she had a reason to keep pushing forward. The day before the event, or at least the day people whispered it would happen, Vivian found herself perched on a shabby bench as dusk settled over the city. She gripped the edge of the seat, her breath visible in the cool evening air, trying to sort through the mess in her mind. Her nerves were practically screaming. She had next to nothing: torn clothes, worn-out shoes, and a heart that was so bruised it was a miracle it still beat. But the thought of skipping the event never seriously crossed her mind. If she let this chance slip by, she might be giving up on the only lead she had to find her son. So, she stared at the fading light in the sky, going over the rumors she'd gathered like a checklist. Dress code? She had no nice clothes, so that would have to be damned. Invitation? Still not sure if she needed one, but she'd wing it. Transportation? Well, she'd walk if she had to, though it was rumored to be quite a distance. It didn't matter, she'd crawl if it meant seeing someone who might help. She felt torn between a shaky hope and a bone-deep exhaustion. Part of her wanted to lie down on that bench and let the night swallow her up. But another part, the mother inside her, refused to back down. She owed it to her missing son to keep going. So, with trembling hands, she braced herself and whispered a quiet prayer into the twilight. "Let this be real," she murmured, eyes closed. "Please, let me find something. A clue, a lead, anything." When the final glow of the sun disappeared behind the buildings, she stood up. Her stomach churned with nerves, but she'd made her decision. She'd go to that event no matter what it took. The following morning, Vivian set out before dawn with nothing but a tattered backpack holding her precious keepsakes and a bottle of water. She'd heard the venue was across town, maybe even further, but she didn't have the bus fare. Walking was her only option. She headed out, shoulders stiff with determination, ignoring the dull ache in her feet that worsened with every step. As she navigated the busy streets, she couldn't help but recall her old life, driving her reliable sedan through these very roads, complaining about traffic or construction. That seemed like a lifetime ago. Now every crosswalk and alleyway carried new meaning. She'd glance at people rushing by, well-dressed and busy, and wonder if any of them would have recognized her back in the day when her hair was shiny and her eyes weren't so hollow. Sometimes she'd pause, catching a flash of memory, her son's small hand in hers as they crossed. To avoid highway traffic. A sense of loss nearly made her legs buckle, but she pressed on, forging a path through the city's chaos. The journey wasn't smooth. At one point, she stumbled over a broken piece of sidewalk, scraping her knee, but she gritted her teeth and kept moving. She passed rows of tents where other homeless folks lived, some looking hopeless, others glaring suspiciously. She understood their wariness. No one trusts easily when you've been kicked around by life. Hours later, as the sun reached its peak, her body screamed for a break, but she knew time was running out. She pressed on with a single thought in her mind. This event was her best shot at finding clues about her son. Nothing was going to stop her now. When Vivian finally reached the rumored location, a grand hotel on the upscale side of the city, she couldn't believe her eyes. The building seemed to stretch into the sky, with a marquee of glittering lights spelling out some fancy name she'd never heard before. Large doors swung open, revealing a lobby that practically glowed with polished marble floors and chandeliers. She hesitated, unsure if she should even step inside. Her clothes were torn, her hair was a mess, and her face was etched with the remnants of heartbreak. She felt like a stray dog wandering into a palace. But no one stopped her. In fact, a few people dressed in uniform actually guided her toward a massive banquet hall. The place was decked out in twinkling fairy lights, tall table centerpieces, and rows of chairs facing a stage. Felt surreal. She saw other people who seemed homeless, too, some wearing mismatched shoes and frayed jackets, looking just as overwhelmed as she felt. Staff members were handing out water bottles, offering seats, and even pointing folks toward restrooms if they wanted to freshen up. It was like a bizarre dream, a mix of charity and extravagance. Vivian took it all in, her heart pounding. She found a corner seat away from the center of attention, sinking onto the plush chair like it was the softest cloud. For a moment, she nearly forgot her troubles because the setting was so stunning. There was even a lavish buffet at one side, with mouth-watering dishes that made her stomach growl. She was too nervous to approach it just yet, but the mere sight of it reminded her she hadn't eaten much today. For now, she allowed herself a tiny breath of relief. She was inside, and if any answers or connections were to be found, at least she was in the right place. Seated in that sprawling hall, Vivian watched people file in. Some wore their hardship like a second skin, dirty clothes, unkempt hair, lined faces that spoke of living rough. Others had tried to clean up a bit, maybe wearing donated suits or dresses that were a few sizes off. A couple of them displayed nervous smiles, while others kept their eyes down, like they were waiting for the other shoe to drop. She felt a kinship with them. After all, they each had their own heartbreaking stories, even if she didn't know the details. Then there were the event organizers, sponsors, and the occasional well-dressed socialite. They moved around with practiced grace, greeting each other politely, their laughter ringing out in stark contrast to the quiet tension among the homeless guests. Vivian's heart fluttered with anxiety. She felt like a raw nerve completely exposed. Should she approach someone? Ask about her son? Or would she just be brushed aside as a grieving mother still stuck in denial? She also couldn't help but notice a few in-between folks who seemed a bit out of place, maybe volunteers or staff who looked uncertain about how to interact with the guests. They'd offer a stiff smile, nod politely, and then hurry off. Vivian understood their hesitation. This was a strange collision of two worlds that rarely met on equal footing. But she held onto the hope that somewhere in this room was the key to unlocking her son's fate. As she sat there, fiddling with the hem of her worn shirt, she felt a swirl of emotions: excitement, fear, longing, and that ever-present ache of loss. Part of her wanted to bolt out of the room, but the other part, the mother's heart, kept her rooted to her seat. This might be her last shot, and she wasn't about to give up now. The lights dimmed, and all eyes turned to the stage at the front of the grand hall. A hush fell over the crowd, and you could almost feel everyone holding their breath. Vivian clutched her seat, her pulse racing, wondering what was about to happen. A tall, middle-aged woman in a sleek dress stepped up to a podium. She introduced herself as one of the top coordinators of this annual event and explained how they wanted to provide resources, medical checkups, counseling services, job fairs, the whole 9 yards. It was heartfelt, sure, but Vivian couldn't shake a sense of restlessness. She appreciated the generosity, but she also felt like she was in the middle of a performance. The coordinator's speech flowed seamlessly into short presentations. A young man who'd been homeless for years spoke about how he found stable housing and a job thanks to the support from these events. A social worker explained how critical mental health services were for the homeless community. Each story was met with polite applause from the audience. Vivian glanced around at the other homeless guests. Some were listening intently, hopeful. Others looked skeptical, maybe even resentful. After all, not everyone trusts the system that let them fall through the cracks in the first place. Still, Vivian couldn't deny the sense of possibility in the air. Maybe, just maybe, there was someone backstage or in the audience who could help her. She thought about how she might approach them. Should she track down the coordinator afterward? Could she corner one of the wealthy patrons who seemed eager to donate? She had to be strategic, but also genuine. She couldn't risk being dismissed as just another broken soul with a sob story. Her mind whirred with questions, her heart pounding a steady, urgent beat as the stage lights continued to shift and glow. Suddenly, the spotlight swung to the other side of the stage, and a young man walked out dressed in a crisp suit that fit him perfectly. He moved with an easy confidence, like he'd done this 100 times before. Vivian squinted from her seat, trying to catch a better look at his face, feeling a strange tug of recognition she couldn't explain. He greeted the audience with a warm smile, and something about that smile made Vivian's heart skip a beat. There was a brightness in his eyes, a certain tilt to his lips that seemed eerily familiar. She leaned forward, her throat tightening. Was it just her mind playing tricks, conjuring a piece of her lost family in every kind face she saw? She took a shaky breath, telling herself not to read too much into it. He introduced himself as one of the main contributors to this event, someone who had a vested interest in helping those who'd lost their way. He spoke with a kindness and poise that drew the audience in. He mentioned that he'd faced hardships himself in the past, though he didn't give specifics, and that he believed in second chances. Every word resonated with Vivian, stirring something deep inside her. She stared at him, analyzing every feature, the shape of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, the way he gestured with his hands. She couldn't pinpoint exactly what felt familiar, but it was like a memory trying to resurface. Doubt and hope collided in her chest. Could it be? No, that was impossible. Her son would still be just a boy. This man was clearly an adult, successful and self-assured. Yet, a part of her soul wouldn't let go of the uncanny feeling that he was connected to her somehow. While the man continued his speech, Vivian felt her heartbeat hammering in her ears. She started cataloging every detail that reminded her of her little boy, tiny habits and quirks that only a mother would notice. There was a slight tilt to his head when he smiled and a way he pushed his hair back that sent a jolt of recognition straight to her heart. She'd seen her son do that exact same thing 1,000 times, but in a smaller, more childlike manner. Then he turned, momentarily catching the light at a certain angle, and she caught sight of his eyes, deep, soulful, and oddly reminiscent of her husband's gaze. A shockwave coursed through her body. She felt like she was gonna faint. The air in the room seemed to vanish, and she had to fight to take a breath. Could this be her son, all grown up? But the timeline didn't match. Logically, her boy would still be far too young to be a grown man like this. Still, logic never kept a mother's heart from hoping. Adrenaline surged, and a swirling rush of disbelief collided with a fierce, desperate yearning. Her hands clamped onto the arms of her seat until her knuckles turned white. She whispered under her breath, "No, it can't be, can it?" She flashed back to the day of the accident. The police had never confirmed her son's body was found. It had always been missing. Now here stood a man who bore a striking resemblance to her lost child, right down to the way he blinked rapidly when he got emotional. As if reading her mind, he paused on stage, scanning the crowd for a heartbeat. She swore he lingered on her seat for just a second, and she gasped, her whole existence teetering on the edge of hope and horror. Vivian couldn't think straight. The rest of the presentation blurred into noise as this young man finished talking and politely stepped off the stage. She watched him move into the wings, her breath catching in her throat. Without warning, she rose to her feet, ignoring the curious glances from others around her. Her heart drummed like a frantic beat in her chest, telling her she had to go after him, had to see if he really was her son, or at least get close enough for a second look. She slipped through the crowd, trying to remain inconspicuous in her ragged clothing. But subtlety had never been her strong suit, especially now when desperation pulled her like a magnet. She reached the backstage entrance only to be stopped by a security guard who kindly but firmly told her it was off limits. Normally Vivian would have backed down, but not this time. She circled around, searching for another way to get behind the scenes. She found a narrow corridor leading to a set of stairs, and she followed it, heart pounding in her ears. Every step felt like walking on hot coals. She was terrified of what she might find, but even more scared of turning back. Her mind was racing. If that man truly was her son, how did he age so fast? Had she lost track of more time than she realized? Or maybe he just reminded her of her child and she was fooling herself. But something in her gut kept pushing her forward. Finally, she arrived at a small backstage corridor. Her eyes darted around in the dim lighting, and then she spotted him down the hallway talking quietly with someone. The blood roared in her ears and she instinctively crept closer, the silent chase intensifying with every shaky step. Vivian inched closer, pressing herself against the wall so she could watch without being seen. She saw him accept a glass of water from an assistant and run a hand through his hair, a gesture so achingly familiar it made her eyes well up with tears. She swallowed hard, trying to keep her emotions under control, but it felt impossible. Every second brought her both closer and further away from the truth. She realized she couldn't just stand there, paralyzed. She had to act, even though 100 doubts flooded her mind. What if she confronted him and he turned out to be a stranger? What if security hauled her away before she could get a word out? Or worse, what if he really was her son and he didn't remember her at all? Could her already fragile heart handle the kind of rejection? Summoning courage she didn't know she still had, Vivian stepped forward. The bustling backstage area felt like an entirely different world, lights, cables, staff running to and fro. But she didn't care about any of that. Her eyes were fixed on this young man standing just a few feet away. Her throat tightened and she found it nearly impossible to form words. At that moment he turned slightly and their gazes almost met. She hesitated, then took another trembling step. The distance between them was more than physical, it was years of heartbreak, confusion, and longing. Yet, with each footfall, she closed that gap, determined to shatter the barrier that had kept them apart, if, indeed, he was who she believed he might be. Her heart thumped in her chest as she prepared to do something that felt more monumental than anything she'd ever done. She was about to call out to him, to break the silence once and for all. Vivian's voice came out thin and shaky at first, barely above a whisper. She tried again, forcing out the only name that truly mattered in her life. David? The moment it left her lips, her heart clenched in her chest. In that single word, she poured all her hopes, fears, and every ounce of love she still carried for her lost son. She saw him freeze in place, like every muscle in his body had turned to stone. Time seemed to slow down, the frantic noise of the backstage fading into a muted hum. The assistant by his side looked confused, but he locked eyes with Vivian, a flash of recognition or maybe just surprise at how she was staring so intently. She tried again, this time louder, her voice trembling with raw emotion. "David." It was a plea, a prayer, and a desperate call. A hush seemed to fall over the immediate area, as if the universe itself paused to bear witness to this moment. Vivian felt tears spilling down her cheeks, hot and relentless, but she didn't wipe them away. She stood there, chest tight, breath uneven, waiting for the impossible. The man slowly turned around, his eyes searching the crowd until they landed on her. Vivian watched a flicker of something cross his face, a mixture of shock, confusion, and maybe a glimmer of recognition. She didn't dare blink, afraid the vision would disappear. Her entire being was wound up like a spring, ready to snap. The few onlookers around them glanced back and forth, not knowing what to make of the situation. In that suspended moment, mother and potential son stood separated by a few steps and countless years of pain. But she'd said his name. Now, the question was whether he'd respond to it. He stared at her for a long beat, his expression a kaleidoscope of emotions that flickered too fast to read. Vivian's heart felt like it might explode from her chest. She wanted to rush toward him, but her feet refused to move. It was like the entire world hinged on what he'd say or do next. She called him David, her son's name, and if he denied her, she wasn't sure she'd ever recover. Finally, he took a cautious step forward. The assistant tried to interject, maybe to ask if everything was okay, but the young man lifted a hand, signaling them to stand down. His gaze never left Vivian's face. Step by step, he approached, and the tension around them was electric. Even backstage staff seemed to feel it, halting their tasks to watch the scene unfold. When he was just a foot away, he spoke softly, almost a whisper, "How do you know that name?" His voice trembled, and Vivian could tell he was fighting to keep his composure. She swallowed hard, trying to find her voice among the tsunami of emotions crashing inside her. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but she forced herself to speak. "You're my son," she said, voice cracking on each syllable. She repeated it, this time more firmly, "You're my son. I lost you in an accident years ago." "I've been searching." She couldn't finish the sentence. She was about to tell him how she'd searched for him in every face she passed on the streets, how she never truly gave up hope that he was still alive. The man's face went pale, and his eyes flickered with something unnameable. In that moment, Vivian braced herself for either the sweetest reunion or the cruelest heartbreak. She held her breath, waiting for fate's final word. In the silence that followed, it felt like the air itself was charged. Vivian couldn't stop shaking, her whole body quivered with adrenaline, fear, and overwhelming hope. He opened his mouth to speak, but words seemed to fail him. Instead, he just looked at her in a way that pierced straight through her soul. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then something in him seemed to break loose. She saw the tears first, barely noticeable at the corners of his eyes. But then they came more forcefully, streaking down his cheeks. It was like he'd been holding back a dam of emotion that finally burst. Without warning, he reached out and wrapped his arms around her. Vivian's breath hitched as she felt the warmth of this almost stranger who might be her son. She latched onto him, sobbing into his shoulder. No words were spoken for a long moment. Their bodies communicated 1,000 things, pain, relief, longing, all meshing in a single desperate embrace. Around them, a hush had fallen. Even the staff, who had no clue what was happening, seemed to sense this was something monumental. Vivian clung to him like he was her lifeline, tears soaking into his immaculate suit. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't even begin to articulate. How did he survive? Why was he here? Who had he become in all these lost years? But for now, she let those questions remain silent. She was lost in the sensation of holding him again, of feeling his heartbeat against hers, of inhaling the scent of someone who felt like home and heartbreak all at once. When they finally pulled apart, they both searched each other's faces, trying to make sense of the miracle that had just slammed into both of their lives. The world around them blurred, leaving just the two of them, mother and son, wrapped in a cocoon of raw emotion. The tears wouldn't stop flowing from either of them. Vivian's face was hot and damp, and her heart throbbed with such intensity she wondered if she could handle the strain. She kept touching his arms, his face, his shoulders, like she had to confirm he was real. Every time her trembling fingers brushed against him, a fresh wave of tears sprang forth. The young man, David, or whoever he was now, looked just as overwhelmed, his eyes shining with the same disbelief and unshed sorrow that had been choking Vivian for years. They stood there, locked in that emotional embrace, unable to form sentences that made any sense. Words like, "Mom," and "I thought you were gone," and "It's been so long," were spoken in fragmented whispers. Each phrase was like a stab of both agony and relief. The staff around them, once bustling with purpose, had turned into silent onlookers, probably trying to piece together what was happening. Vivian felt centuries of pain pour out of her in those tears, memories of the accident, the nights spent on the streets, the hopeless days when she thought she'd lost everything. In finding him now, she felt both delirious joy and a staggering grief for all the years they'd missed. Part of her was screaming at the injustice of it. Why did life have to snatch away their time together only to drop this reunion on them out of the blue? Yet she was thankful. Thankful he was alive, thankful she could hold him, thankful for this improbable moment that she'd prayed for so desperately. Through broken sobs, she managed to say, "I'm so sorry. I never stopped looking for you." And with that confession, she felt something begin to mend, though she knew the road to healing was just getting started. After the emotional storm calmed a bit, floating, part disbelief and part sheer adrenaline, she clutched her son's hand, terrified that if she let go, he might vanish again. He, in turn, kept glancing at her as if memorizing every line on her face. They started piecing together the puzzle of their past, painful, jagged fragments that were finally finding their place. The young man explained that after the accident, he'd woken up in a hospital with severe injuries and no memory of who he was. He'd been labeled a John Doe for a while. A philanthropist who visited pediatric wards took an interest in him, eventually providing medical care and later adopting him, giving him a new name and life. As the years passed, bits of his memory returned, but never enough to find his original family. Eventually, he learned to push those uncertainties aside and focused on building a future. The man he called his adoptive father was actually the billionaire behind this event. Vivian, tears still brimming, filled in the rest, the heartbreak, the sleepless nights, the fruitless searches, the unsolved question of where he'd gone. She told him about losing their home, her struggles on the street, and the indescribable emptiness she'd felt. Each sentence was like ripping off a bandage, exposing raw wounds. But somehow sharing this pain made it more bearable. When their stories finally aligned, they realized the gravity of what they'd lost, years of birthdays, holidays, and everyday moments of motherhood and childhood that they could never get back. Yet here they were, against all odds, sitting side by side. Though the past was full of shattered pieces, those pieces were now, at long last, being carefully fit back together. David, he wanted her to call him that again, even though it wasn't the name he'd been using, looked at Vivian with a complicated mix of emotions. He explained how the billionaire, his adoptive father, had nurtured him, educated him, and propelled him into the world of business. David had risen to prominence, helping orchestrate this annual event for the homeless, a cause that resonated with vague memories of hardship he couldn't quite place. The success and power he enjoyed now came with a price. He had to maintain a certain image, and digging into his murky past wasn't exactly encouraged. Vivian felt her heart squeeze. She was grateful this man had saved her son's life, but she couldn't help feeling a pang of jealousy that someone else got to watch him grow up. Still, she also felt a rush of awe. Her little boy had gone on to become someone influential and caring, someone who gave back to the community. That was all a mother could really hope for, despite the tragic circumstances. But a larger question hung over them. What about the accident? Who was responsible for the chain of events that tore their family apart? David admitted he'd had suspicions for a while, especially as random flashes of memory surfaced, blinding lights, screeching tires, the feeling of impact. But every time he tried to find records of his past, he ran into dead ends. It wasn't until this event, ironically, that fate finally brought him face to face with the truth. This revelation weighed heavily on both of them. The accident wasn't just a freak occurrence, it felt like there was more to the story. Vivian's heart pounded as she realized they both wanted answers. They'd lost too much already, and the time had come to uncover the truth behind the tragedy that shattered their lives. They decided right then and there to work together and dig up the truth about the accident. It was an unspoken agreement, sealed by years of longing and heartbreak. David told her he had resources now, investigators, access to records, and the ear of his influential adoptive father. Vivian, though wary of powerful figures after everything she'd been through, couldn't deny that his help might finally uncover what the authorities never did. In a quiet, makeshift backstage office, David handed Vivian a fresh set of clothes, nothing fancy, just comfortable pants, a shirt, and some decent shoes. She felt awkward at first, but he insisted, his eyes filled with compassion. "You shouldn't have to face the world like you're invisible," he said softly. It was an odd role reversal, almost like a son caring for his mother, but in that moment it felt natural. As she changed, Vivian wondered how life had twisted itself into this bizarre shape. One day, she was homeless and hopeless. The next, she was reunited with her long-lost son who'd become a wealthy philanthropist. It was a lot to take in, and she felt overwhelmed, but there was no going back now. She wasn't alone anymore. She had David by her side. They emerged together, hand in hand, to the shock of staff members who'd seen the emotional scene earlier. David guided her to a private lounge away from the main event where they could speak without interruptions. Over cups of water, they outlined their plan. David would leverage his network discreetly at first to find any hidden files or witness accounts from the day of the accident. Vivian would share everything she remembered, every detail that might spark a lead. Their destinies, once torn apart, were now intertwined again, bound by the need for answers and the hope of finding closure. With a renewed sense of purpose, Vivian felt her spirit stir in a way it hadn't in years. For so long, she'd been stuck in a loop of trauma and grief, barely surviving on the streets. Now, she had a chance not just to reclaim her life, but to uncover the truth behind the accident and, in doing so, maybe help others who'd been tossed aside. She couldn't believe how quickly things had changed. In a single day, she'd gone from hopeless wanderer to a determined mother with an actual plan. David arranged for them to leave the event early, slipping out a side entrance to avoid too many prying eyes. He led her to a sleek, black car waiting by the curb, the kind of luxury Vivian had long forgotten existed. She settled into the plush seat, her mind racing with everything that needed to be done. But first, she needed rest, and David seemed to sense that. He said they'd head to a discreet location, a comfortable apartment he kept for visiting clients, where she could shower, eat, and finally catch her breath. On the ride over, they shared more fragments of their stories. David confided that while he'd enjoyed material success, he always felt a gnawing emptiness, like a puzzle missing a crucial piece. He'd had recurring dreams, flashes of laughter, and a warm presence he couldn't place. Now it was clear that presence was Vivian's love, lingering even when he didn't know her name. Listening to him, Vivian felt a fierce pride. Her boy, no matter how he'd been raised, grew up to be compassionate and thoughtful. As the car navigated city streets, the headlights illuminating the dark roads ahead, Vivian closed her eyes. She was stepping into a new chapter, one she never saw coming. It was scary, but at least this time she wasn't alone. Later that evening, Vivian found herself in a cozy apartment that felt worlds away from the cold alleys she'd slept in not long ago. She stood under a hot shower, tears mixing with the water streaming down her face. She thought about her husband, about the unborn child she lost, about the years of searching for David. Those painful memories loomed in her mind, refusing to let go. But now, there was a spark of hope, an opportunity to shine a light on the shadows that had plagued her for so long. When she emerged from the shower, David was seated at a small kitchen table, scrolling through his phone with a focused look. He glanced up, offering a reassuring smile that warmed her heart. She joined him, and they talked about the steps ahead. They'd need to contact old police investigators, maybe hire a private detective if necessary. David had connections that might help obtain footage, hospital records, anything that could point to foul play or a cover-up. Because the more they thought about it, the less it seemed like a simple accident. Vivian confided that she'd always felt there was something off about how quickly the case was closed and how no one gave her straightforward answers about her son's disappearance. David listened intently, taking notes, determination hardening his features. There was a new intensity in the air, a sense that they were about to stir the waters of a past some might prefer to remain still. She still felt that ache of loss when she thought about the husband and baby she'd never get back. But maybe, just maybe, uncovering the truth would bring some semblance of closure. The past was full of shadows, but with David by her side, she finally believed they had a chance to bring those secrets into the light. In the days that followed, Vivian felt a transformation happening inside her. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was actively living, searching, pushing forward. David found her a small place to stay in one of his organization's transitional housing units. It was nothing fancy, but it had a clean bed, a functioning kitchen, and the promise of stability for the first time in ages. Every morning, she woke up with a renewed sense of purpose, ready to tackle the next clue or phone call. They began to meet with various contacts, ex-police officers who remembered the crash, medical staff who might still have records, and even an old neighbor who recalled odd details from that day. Each conversation felt like peeling back another layer of the onion. Sometimes they found promising leads, other times they hit dead ends. But they pressed on, fueled by the need for answers and the bond that had only grown stronger since their reunion. For Vivian, it was like she was finally taking control of her life again. She wasn't just the grieving widow or the homeless woman begging for change. She was a mother determined to protect her son and honor the memory of the family she lost. And in David, she saw a mirror of that resolve. He'd led a successful life by most standards, but something about this quest for truth seemed to invigorate him too. It was as if they were both finding redemption, her from the guilt of not saving her family, him from the feeling of being a puzzle missing a few vital pieces. Their progress wasn't without challenges. There were moments of frustration, nights when Vivian cried herself to sleep because the weight of it all felt crushing. But each morning she rose again, reminded that redemption was within reach if they could just keep pushing through the pain and uncertainty. Eventually, their tireless pursuit led them to some unsettling truths about the accident. While the details remain something only they can fully understand, what they found out painted a larger picture of negligence, hidden agendas, and a web of powerful individuals who'd have preferred the truth stay buried. In the end, shining a light on those secrets wasn't easy, but it gave Vivian and David something priceless: closure. They learned the accident hadn't just been a freak tragedy, it had been set in motion by forces they never imagined. Yet, knowing this finally let them breathe a bit easier, free of the torment that comes from never understanding why something so terrible could happen. Their journey also paved the way for a deeper, more profound bond. Mother and son, separated by unspeakable tragedy, found themselves together again, rebuilding a relationship that fate had tried to steal. It wasn't perfect, there were years of memories they could never reclaim, and the pain of losing her husband and unborn child would always cast a shadow. But they had each other, and that was more than either of them had dared hope for. Standing on a balcony one crisp morning, Vivian looked out over the city with David by her side. The sky was painted with pinks and oranges, a breathtaking dawn that seemed to mirror the fresh start unfolding in her life. She glanced at her son, seeing in him both the little boy she used to tuck in at night and the determined man he'd become. They didn't need words to acknowledge what lay ahead: healing, growth, and a life they'd shape together. Maybe they'd expand his philanthropic work, focusing on families torn apart by tragedy. Maybe they'd travel. The specifics didn't matter as much as the unspoken promise they shared to stand by each other, to cherish the newfound bond, and to let love guide them into whatever the future held. Because in that dawn, reconciliation wasn't just a hope, it had become their reality.